It was a dark and stormy night when Dr. Emily Lawson, a weary but dedicated physician, received an urgent call from St. Agnes Hospital. A horrific accident had occurred on the outskirts of town, and the hospital was flooded with casualties. Emily quickly donned her white coat and rushed out the door, her mind filled with images of blood-soaked victims and the chaos that awaited her. As she arrived at the hospital, the rain pelted down and thunder roared ominously in the distance. The emergency room was a frenzy of activity, with nurses and doctors scurrying about, tending to the injured. Emily felt a sinking sensation in her stomach as she realized the magnitude of the disaster. She immediately began to assess the wounded, her years of experience kicking in as she worked tirelessly to save lives. Hours turned into an endless night, and Emily lost track of time. The injured kept pouring in, each more horrifically mangled than the last. The hospital's staff was overwhelmed, and the atmosphere in the ER grew increasingly tense. Emily's fatigue was overwhelming, but she couldn't stop. Lives depended on her. Around dawn, the worst seemed to be over. The injured had been stabilized, and the chaos had subsided. Emily, her face pale and her hands trembling, finally took a moment to sit down and catch her breath. The emergency room was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the pandemonium of the night. But the respite was short-lived. A nurse burst into the room, panic in her eyes. "Dr. Lawson, we need you in Ward 13, she said, her voice quivering. Ward 13 was the hospital's old psychiatric ward, long abandoned and rarely used. Emily hadn't set foot in there since her residency, and the thought of going back sent shivers down her spine. "What's going on there?" she asked, her voice steady despite her unease. The nurse hesitated for a moment before speaking. "One of the patients from Ward 13 was brought in earlier. He's in bad shape, but that's not the worst part. The staff who went in to check on him. They haven't come out." Emily exchanged a worried glance with the nurse, then followed her down a dimly lit corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. The air in Ward 13 was heavy and oppressive, and the smell of decay lingered in the stale atmosphere. As they approached the door to the patient's room, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The room was pitch black, save for the feeble light of a flickering overhead bulb. Emily's heart raced as she entered, and the nurse hesitated at the doorway, unwilling to step any further. The patient, a man in his 40s, lay in a decrepit hospital bed. His face was hidden behind matted hair, and his frail body was covered in bruises and lacerations. Emily took a deep breath and approached the bed, her trembling hand reaching for the man's pulse. His skin was ice cold, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. It was clear that he was on the brink of death. As Emily worked to stabilize the patient, a guttural, inhuman sound echoed through the room. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It was the sound of agony mixed with something else, something otherworldly. The nurse, unable to contain her fear any longer, bolted from the room, leaving Emily alone with the dying patient. She tried to focus on her work, but the room seemed to close in around her. The flickering light cast eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper, and the air grew even colder. With a final desperate effort, Emily managed to stabilize the patient, but his condition was still critical. As she turned to leave the room, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. She spun around, her heart in her throat, and gasped in horror. The patient's body had contorted in unnatural ways, his limbs bending at impossible angles. His eyes, previously hidden by his hair, were now open wide, revealing jet-black pupils that seemed to absorb all light. A low, menacing growl emanated from his twisted mouth. Emily stumbled backward, her mind racing. She had to get out of there, had to escape the nightmare that Ward 13 had become. But as she turned to flee, she found the door had slammed shut, trapping her inside with the abomination before her. Panic set in as Emily desperately searched for a way out. The room seemed to warp and shift around her, its walls closing in. She could hear whispers in the shadows, voices that spoke of madness and despair. The malevolent presence in the room grew stronger, and the patient's body contorted even further, his limbs elongating like a grotesque marionette. With no other option, Emily lunged for the window, smashing the glass with her elbow. She climbed out onto a narrow ledge that ran along the side of the building, the rain soaking her to the bone. She clung to the ledge, her eyes darting around for any sign of escape. As Emily peered into the window from which she had escaped, she saw the patient's twisted form pressed against the glass, his malevolent gaze fixed on her. He grinned, revealing rows of sharp, serrated teeth, and Emily knew that she was not alone on the ledge. The nurse had returned, her eyes glazed over, and she advanced toward Emily with a vacant expression. It was as if she had been possessed by the same malevolent force that had taken hold of the patient. Emily backed away, her mind racing for a way to escape. With no other option, Emily made a perilous leap from the ledge, landing in a puddle of muddy water below. She staggered to her feet, her body aching, and raced toward the hospital's entrance. The rain continued to pour, and thunder rumbled ominously overhead. As Emily burst through the hospital doors, she was met with the sight of chaos once again. Patients and staff alike were in the grip of madness, their faces twisted in agony. She pushed her way through the throng, determined to escape the nightmare that had engulfed St. Agnes Hospital. Outside, the storm raged on, but Emily didn't stop running until she had reached the safety of her car. She sped away from the hospital, her mind reeling from the horrors she had witnessed. She knew that she could never return to that place, that the malevolent force within Ward 13 was something beyond human comprehension. In the days that followed, the incident at St. Agnes Hospital was shrouded in mystery. The authorities investigated, but no one could explain what had happened in Ward 13 that night. Emily resigned from her position at the hospital, haunted by the memory of the patient's contorted form and the nurse's vacant eyes. Years passed, but Emily could never shake the feeling that the malevolent presence from Ward 13 still lingered, waiting to ensnare its next victim. She would often wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing, as if the nightmare had never truly ended. And so, the legend of Ward